Woo! So the first speaker is Casey Messiha. Casey Messiha is an accomplished interdisciplinary artist and musician, and community organizer. There are two experiences that guide her artistic practice, being a singer-songwriter and her experience in as an arts educator. In tandem with her graduate studies in arts education, sociology and equity, and post-colonial theory, Casey aims to create art that signifies the complexity of her personality and desires. Casey Messiha, thank you.
Thanks. Hello. Thank you for having me, for opening up space in which to theorize and reflect on the queer dimensions of Filipino diaspora in Canada. I am grateful for the invitation to speak about my experiences making music and art as a queer Filipino woman in Toronto, and the affective encounters I have had with the reception of my work. In this talk, I'm interested in music performance as a racializing process. I want to put pressure on what is at stake for queer Asian women performing within the context of white settler colonialism in Canada, and explicate on what is ultimately queer about an Asian woman playing pop music in Canada. I'm inquiring into how my body has been inscribed as a performer and questioning the affective outcomes of being read through romanticized lenses in a multicultural landscape. For many years, I've defined myself in part as frontwoman for the band Au Bijou. After some commercial and critical success, extensive touring, and hundreds of live shows, feels like thousands, actually, our band decided to go on hiatus. My relationship to this band and to our reception is one of ambivalence. Good feelings are tinged with complicated responses from critics and larger audiences due to my race, gender, and sexuality. As I continue to make music and art outside of Au Bijou, my artistic practice is informed by an archive of experience which pushes me to complicate the ways in which I live and imagine my own Asian and queer subjectivity, while interrogating the unwilled ways that audiences reflect myself back to me. What has been termed the affective turn in cultural studies influences my thinking on what sorts of emotions, affects, and feelings circulate when I am on stage. As an artist and musician, I have found that white productions of gender are more accepted than racialized performances of gender. The notion of success in music relies on how marketable you are to a dominant culture of whiteness. White formations of femininity allow subjects to expand and truly think that in extrapolating on the political potential of reinscribing what has been abjected, there is hope for a new way of encountering music. At this moment, encouraged by a community of queer and feminist artists, many of whom are in the room today, I am seeking a way out of the confines of an economy of stereotypes that circulate around my body. It is a relief to realize that there are many ways of being Filipino, and there are many ways of feeling queer. It is something that cannot be contained, as it is always shifting. Frantz Fanon pleaded, "Oh, my body, make me a man that always questions," a question which resonates here. Inspired by my experiences coordinating the Clutch program run out of the Kapisanan's Philippine Center for Arts and Culture, an arts program which explores identity for young Filipino women, I was motivated to seek out my own relationship to queerness as part of my Filipino heritage. The Clutch program, arguably, is a queer undertaking because participants are encouraged to create artistic responses to what it means to be Filipino in Canada. And in so doing, they must queer what they know about who they are and assemble new formulations of selfhood. Participants are encouraged to explore what Stuart Hall calls the unstable points of identification, the constant reproduction and transformation of identity. My use of queer here is not only a reference to abnormal or minoritized sexual identities, but to the process of making strange. Like many of you here today, I want to imagine queerness beyond the bounds of identity. I'm excited by thinking about queerness as a dynamic between a people and a space that can be identified as something outside of LGBTQ. David Halperin defines queer as whatever is at odds with the normal, the legitimate, the dominant. There's nothing in particular to which it necessarily refers. It is an identity without an essence. Reading Halperin along Eve Sedgwick, queer can be understood as an unstable and transformative force. I absolutely want to think of queerness as transformative along with collaborative and coalition building. So what do I mean by queer spaces? In the last 2 decades, scholars and practitioners have used queer to re-articulate the grammar of architecture and cultural production. Queer space is often referred to as the process by which space is reconstructed through the challenging of social norms of desire and sexuality. Queerness can be the challenging of normative uses of space through art, performance, through political engagement. In this sense, my appearances on stage and albums playing Canadian pop music was queer, not only because of my sexuality, but also because it was dissident and unexpected. I will continue to make music, visual art, and film as craft and as a therapeutic practice to respond to colonial histories and the movement of racialized bodies amidst the landscape of Canadian multiculturalism. And I continue to find comfort and inspiration in the young Filipino artists who, through the art and alliances they make in local arts programs like Clutch, queer assumptions of both history and future. The recognition that I will never, despite arduous and devoted research, locate the source or definition of my queer Filipino identity does not disappoint me. Instead, a quest for understanding my difference and role in this metropolis productively reveals the creative space of the impossibility of Filipino and queer identity. Perhaps that is what I will leave you with. Maybe in order to better take care of each other, we must imagine our bodies as not part of the answer or a remedy, but as part of an internal inquiry. I will leave you with a song, the lyrics of which marked the first time that I found the strength to speak directly to my Filipino-ness and the injury which is forced migration. It's called Balikbayan, which borrows its name from a Tagalog term for both goods and bodies, which move across Filipino diasporic roots. So if it's all right, I'll play that song. Yeah. Normally when I play this, I have 5 other people with me, so this is a bit different. Is this okay? Can you hear me? Yeah. Here on these hours, the sun hangs over the parallel, the spell. We feel the myth, the distance like a metal case. My family, the limbs of which spread the body of this land. I'll pour my blood on this place to keep you safe, and we'll send it home. Balikbayan. 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 The heavy freight it carries the weight of a better life. You separate, your kids get old, the air gets cold, we feel alone. Our country, the sin between the hours hang. We're still not paid, we'll fold our clothes and write our notes, send them home, send them home. We'll send it home, Balikbayan. We'll send it home, Balikbayan. We'll send it home, Balikbayan. We'll send it home. Keep you afloat, 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 keep you afloat. Thanks.
Wow, no, I can't even speak. Thanks, Casey. Wow, thank you for sharing. Oh, and Christine Balmes, and they'll be setting up. Joe Simalay Alcampo is an interdisciplinary artist born in Manila and raised in raised in Malvern in the heart of Scarborough. Joe currently lives in Toronto on traditional territories of Huron-Wendat Nation and Haudenosaunee people of the Longhouse and Anishinaabe and the Mississauga of New Credit First Nation. Joe's art practice integrates storytelling, installation-based art, and electroacoustic soundscapes. Joe has developed community arts projects with various groups, including queer youth consumer survivors of the mental health system and migrant domestic workers. In 2010, Joe graduated from OCAD University with BFA honors degree in integrated media. Advisors in OCAD Youth Indigenous Visual Culture program inspired Joe to reconnect with her roots.
Hey, thank you so much. Bonjour, Josie Malaya Alcampo Nadishnikas, Manila, Philippines, Nadojaba, Turtle Island, Nadinda. My name is Joe. I was born in Manila, Philippines. Turtle Island is where I live now. And we want to acknowledge the original stewards of the land and our elders and mentors that have been helped guide us as Kapwa Collective and as individuals, and to express gratitude and solidarity as immigrants, newcomers, and diasporic queer Pinays still searching for a home. Thank you for inviting me, Christine, and Kapwa Collective to participate in this gathering. It's great to see Roland again. When I was still an undergrad at OCADU, Roland encouraged me to contribute into developing to the ongoing Filipino studies movement in Toronto, and I didn't feel I had a place because I grew up in Malvern, in the heart of Scarborough, in a working class immigrant family. I was the first generation in my family to go to post-secondary school. I was returning to school after dropping out of U of T to join Carlos Bulosan Theater and eventually come out of the closet by moving downtown. And he said to me, that's exactly the stories that we need. So please keep telling your story. So what Christine and I are going to do is do a bit of storytelling and sharing and go back and forth and play with history, storytelling, and theory. So I'm going to start a bit, or would you like to introduce?
Okay. Yeah, hi. Bonjour, my name is Christine, and I'm also a member of the Kapwa Collective. And yes, so I guess we'll get started.
So my first Kapwa Collective formed 2 years ago in 2010 when we attended the Kapwa 3 conference in Baguio, Philippines. And my first collective was actually a collective that was formed in 1993 here in Toronto, which was Babaylan, which you'll hear more about. We have a panel coming up later today with some of my collective members who are also my dear friends. This was a group that formed as a support group, a mutual support group, and this is us in '95 in an event called Bukluran, which means solidarity. And some of the things we did was we self-taught ourselves Tagalog out of a book, and most of us grew up here, and we learned Philippine history, and we cooked for each other, and gave each other love and support, especially during times when a lot of us lost contact with family and contact with religion and spirituality, and we made home for each other. Ate Angie Umbak is a human rights activist, part of Rainbow Rights Philippines. She visited Toronto to lead the 2011 Toronto Pride March as the International Grand Marshal, as Roland mentioned. And this is her wearing a homemade dress by Bems Benedito, who is part of Ladlad Party List, who's also indigenous to Abra Cordillera. And then she led the Pride March in a malong from Mindanao and Tiboli beads and jacket woven by her friend Pidot, who is an indigenous designer. Ata Angie talks about if we see ourselves as family or a community, we should look out for each other and we should seek justice for each other. This is in response to the fact that biological families often stop investigating after hate crimes leading to death towards LGBT peoples. These are stats from the Philippines. And I feel like this is connected to what Virilio Enriquez talks about, which is a system and value system of kapwa. I'm going to ask Christine to talk about what kapwa is and Virilio Enriquez. Oh, you could use this one.
Hi.
Cool.
Okay. So kapwa is a core value in Philippine psychology as listed here by Virgilio Enriquez. He's the father of Philippine psychology. And kapwa basically means, right here, shared identity. It's kind of the basis of how you can relate to another human being, another creature, or even the earth itself, is the interconnectedness that you share with all the things that are in the world. And we've used it as a core for how we've named ourselves, because it's also the value that we have for each other. So kapwa, I guess, are you going to talk a little bit about how we went to the kapwa conference?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
And then, but I'll move to that. Yes. So this is we're inspired to go to the kapwa conference by Jennifer Maramba, who's our friend, and who is mentored by Catherine de Guia. And this is her definition of kapwa, a Tagalog term widely used when addressing another with the intention of establishing a connection. It reflects a viewpoint that beholds the essential humanity recognizable in everyone, therefore linking, including people, rather than separating, excluding them from each other. Enriquez felt that this orientation was an expression of humanness at its highest level, which is interesting because it also reminds me of this new movement, I guess, connected to the UN, which is SOGI, which seeks to maybe not think so much about LGBT, but think about sexual orientation and sexual identity as something that everyone has. So it's about inclusiveness as opposed to an othering. And kapwa is about seeing the self in the other. And this is the conference.
I wanted to talk a little bit more about kapwa as sort of like a value that we also kind of embody, and it's actually a value that while we've kind of learned a little bit more about the indigenous teachings from this land, from Turtle Island, kapwa is something that's repeated in a lot of indigenous lessons as a way to relate, related to also this idea of the wampum belt. So when you recognize that recognize that a person or an entity has a spirit and has its own sort of value outside of you, but also related to you, it helps you with, just a second. It helps you kind of, it's kind of like a principle for how to deal with other people who may have differences. It's a way to respect, and it's a way to kind of build relationship. So the wampum belt teaching is like, it's basically, you guys know, 2 rows of shells, and then the way that you could think about it is like 2 canoes that are on the same path, but they never collide. So it's a way to kind of build relationships, and also how we relate to the indigenous people that we meet here, as well as the indigenous people in the Philippines that we've made relationships with, as well as with each other. So you recognize that you're in a path, and the other person could also be in a different path.
The Kapwa 3 conference, it's focused on indigenous knowledge in the academia, and it bridges local and global paradigms. So there's 110 ethno-linguistic indigenous groups in the Philippines, and there are representatives, of most of them at the Kapwa conference. And it was at this great place called Vocas in Baguio City. And we weren't even a collective, we were just a group of friends. Jen Maramba, Amy Gomez, Kristen Ciso, and myself and Christine went to give a presentation on a panel, a collective presentation on art as an embodied form of education and sharing. And then we did a jam. We jammed with Singing Plants, UP Baguio students, and some of the leaders of the schools of living traditions in the Philippines, who talked about their need for self-determination, and also a lot of echoes of what indigenous folks on Turtle Island talk about, which is an acknowledgement and respect for the fact that so much of what we benefit from is from the original stewards of that land. This is Katrin playing the Singing Plants, which is a project I developed here at OCAD. They're touch-sensitive plants. When you touch them, they sing indigenous oral chants. This is Manny Dulawan, who's the longtime leader of the Ifugao Academy, which is another school of living traditions. This is our Kapwa Amy, learning the soten, traditionally danced by the Subanen men, expressing strength of character. The left hand clutches a wooden shield, and the right hand shakes dried palm leaves. It calls the attention of the Diwata spirits. The sound of the leaves is believed to be beautiful and pleasing to them. This is Amy on the Sinalimba, a swinging platform, usually only used by men in performance, and it represents a mythic vessel used for journeying. We met the Tibili dreamweavers. This is a form of tinalak that's hand-woven and dyed from abaca fibers. And we connected for the first time with some of the leaders of the School of Living Tradition and Sikat schools.
Later on, what happened is that, so these are,
Sorry. Yes.
these are Lenny Strobel on the right and Lily Mendoza on the left, and they're sisters who are based in Oakland University and Sonoma State University in the States. And they've kind of been leading this kind of reconnecting with the indigenous through the academia in the US, but also here in Canada. So Lenny Strobel, for example, this is her definition of indigenous that we've kind of used as well in our own work. So she says, I use the term indigenous to refer to the self that has found its place, its home in the world, emptied of projections of inferiority, third world, undeveloped, uncivilized, exotic and primitive, and modernizing. It is the self capable of conjuring one's place and growing roots through the work of imagination, reframing history, and retelling the Filipino story that centers our history of resistance, survival, and regeneration. So you can see from this quote that reconnecting with the indigenous is very much related to decolonization and healing. And a lot of art, for example, for me, my personal journey has also been related to that. As we get to know a little bit more about what's indigenous to the Philippines and what has developed in the Philippines out of our own terms, or out of the terms of people who still live in the Philippines have connection to their indigenous roots. That's kind of become a way to critique and also balance the colonization that happens, as diasporic people when we have to assimilate and just survive in Canada or in the global world in general.
One of the last things we did when we were in the Philippines was visit Christine's matrilineal ancestral land, and we planted indigenous trees, 49 of them, and it kind of bonded us. And by the time we got back to Toronto, we decided we were going to form our own collective to continue to do this bridging work. And we called ourselves Kapwa Collective. And Michael Peking joined us when we came back to Toronto. And we met with Lee Miracle at First Nations House at U of T to go to come up with our own kind of medicine or healing wheels around how to guide our guiding principles around identity and safety. And then our first event was a Kapwa speaker series called Batok. We invited a speaker who's, her full name is Annalyn Salvador Amores. We call her Manang Ikin. She's the first Filipino scholar to obtain a master's degree and doctorate in social and cultural anthropology at Oxford University and is currently a professor in anthropology at UP Baguio. Her focus is on Kalinga traditional tattoos in the diaspora. And Manang Ikin focused and talked to us about stories about the Ma Babatok Apo Fangud, who gives the gift of traditional Batok Kalinga tattoo. Christina is one of the folks that spoke at our event about her own journey. And how we started off was to study a book by Lane Wilkinson called Filipino Tattoos, Ancient and Modern. And he talks a bit about sensuality as a form of power through tattoo, and that woman's tattooing is an affirmation of her strength and inherent spiritual power. It's a form of clothing, an enhancement of beauty, and a proclamation of her status. And finally, the tattoos were a form of recognition that allowed the soul of a woman to pass into the afterlife and join the glorious chain of her ancestors. That's from Filipino Tattoos, Ancient and Modern by Lane Wilkinson. Lane Wilkin. How we decided to do our work is through play shops. So we studied tattoo patterns of the batok and etched them onto rubber stamps and facilitated a play shop in the community instead of a workshop. We call them play shops. And people created their own batok-inspired designs. We showed these to Manang Ikin. She gave the stamps originally to Apo Fangud, and it was the feeling was that it's great to create something that's inspired by something traditional and kind of riff on our own kind of ideas on it. So it continues the dialogue and is a bridging project. Manang Ikin came to the 519 in November 2012 and shared her research and talked about her ways of research in the community and an ethical code of conduct. Christina Gison talked about her tattooing journey with Apo Fangud. You want to say something? Chris, yeah. Yes. And then Manang Ikin published a book, Tapping Ink, Tattooing Identities, Traditional and Modernity in Contemporary Kalinga Society in Northern Luzon, Philippines, which won a book prize last year in the Philippines.
I just want to say that also there was an email that Manang Ikin sent recently, and she said that she actually went back to the mountains and gave some medicines and visited the people. And also every time that she goes back, she gives a copy of her book, or she acknowledges the work that she's done through the help of the indigenous people there. So for us, she's given us an example of how to be an ethical researcher, how you develop that relationship and maintain that relationship with the people that you work with.
One of the next events we did was Kapwa on Screen, where we screened Orea Solitos, also known now as Kanakan Balintago's film Pisay, based on Philippine science experienced during the turbulent times of the 1980s during Marcos' dictatorship through the eyes of a really cool high school. And as told by the Butterflies by Naru's Pagduopon, an animated film about Ladlad Party List, Suman Ladies, directed by Althea Balmes, The Dreamweaver, directed by Jed Rommel, and it was a fundraiser for the School of Living Traditions due to Typhoon Bopa. Jen went to give our donations in person to the School of Living Traditions, who's affected by the typhoon. That's her son.
South Cotabato.
In South Cotabato. This is her son, Kawayan, and Jen is also doing a batok-inspired play shop and using inks from the plants in South Cotabato, Lake Cebu. Oh, okay. So we ended up being asked to do a year-long research project at the Guild by the Some Degree Collective on a project called Restless Precinct. So we spent time on the land. It was to kind of explore identities as settlers and respond. And it took a year to do. And in the meantime, we went to the Babaylan conference in Sonoma, and we got to meet the academics that work around indigeneity in the States, and including Grace Nono,
Kidlat Tahimik, Oreo Solito.
and Oreo Solito Kanakan Balintagos. And then Kanakan came to Real Asian to present a premiere of his film, Baybayin, and we introduced the film. It's a beautiful film. It's part of his Palawan trilogy. It focuses on the indigenous language Baybayin, which has sometimes been called Alibata, but it's Baybayin. It's a film about two sisters who have to reconcile their love for the same person that devastated the Philippines, Typhoon Yolanda. We met with Lainey Lasal, who's a Lenape healer and community worker, and she helped us have a retreat as Kapwa in the event called Meeting with Our Ancestors, which helped us. And then Grace Nono came to Toronto. We co-presented with other community organizations. And then Grace Nono also taught us that she wrote a book called Song of the Babaylan. She took all the oral traditions from different indigenous groups in the Philippines, and every time she is asked to speak or is paid to speak, she goes back to those indigenous communities and passes on what she's been paid, and also in other ways as well, maintains that connection in a respectful way. The last event we did this summer was Banek Seeds from Indigenous to Diasporic, was our second speaker series, and we invited our friends from the Tibili School of Living Traditions, Manang Oyog, her daughter Andy, and Manang Buwat, who is a Tibili dream weaver. This is her Ye Camus, which is one of the most prized weaves. This is all done without any mathematical or mechanical calculations, and it's inspired through visitations of Fudalu, who is the spirit of the abaca plant, to the weavers who weave what they dream. We did a lecture at OCAD, and through Ken Vickerson and the Faculty of Design, talked to material arts students about Tinalak dream weaving, and did a series of presentations, including a children's workshop and dialogues with different communities, and we also just hung out. And then we did some connections with the Native community in Toronto. We joined, so this is a year later, we returned back to the Guild and did our presentation. This is Rena Katz, my former OCAD classmate, who's one of the curators with some degree, and Jack and Philip Cote, who led a tour of the First Story Native Canadian Center's bus tour of Toronto. Most bus tours are 400 histories, 400 years of history. Theirs is over 20,000. So we visited Tabor Hill, which is an ossuary, and
where there are bones of the Wendat, I think.
Yes.
Wendat.
And it's over almost 500 ancestors at that time, and we were shared that story with the community. And then we had Restless Precinct, which was our residency at the Guild in Scarborough, and we did different tours. We also did a plantable paper making workshop where you could plant seeds into paper, write letters to the land, and they would go back to the land. Christine played Kulintang and engaged the community in understanding a bit more about that history. And the last thing was we created the singing plants with the Kulintang, and it was a Kulintang healing garden. And this is us with our curators, family, and collective members. Okay, so we, I guess the last thing was around our work is about honoring our Pakiki Pagkapwa, our shared identity. And I think of the words of Mia Mingus, who's a writer, community educator, and organizer working for disability justice and transformative justice. Mia Mingus writes, "Systems of oppression and violence are deeply embedded in our lives and world. Intertwined with each other, and white supremacy and transphobia are not going to be ended in a campaign or in 5, 20, or 50 years. It's going to take a long time, and we have to be committed to each other through it. We have to think of our relationships as long-term relationships with each other, as people we will be working with and plan to know for the next 30, 40 years. Miigwech, masicho, maraming salamat po. Thank you.
No? Maybe I can begin. So I have and I think it's actually worked out very well that we began with Casey's presentation and we've through the other presentations. And so you began by talking about queerness as a kind of really reshifting collectivity itself, like what it would mean, right? So that your reproduction in a kind of multicultural setting is precisely not thinking through those types of pushing of collectivity as like affective in one way you talked about, but also incredibly vulnerable in another, right? And that's part of what really felt to me when I was hearing you and sing. And so I think maybe in the panel, the word queer actually never comes up specifically, right? And I think this goes back to what Roland was saying in the very beginning, and I think it's really great that we're having this conversation. It doesn't come up specifically as queer, but in many ways, when you look at the archive, I mean, that amazing photographs that you'd seen and you've shown us, it is queer. Like, it's incredibly queer in a sense that it's a different type of collectivity. It pushes the boundaries of nation and where we are located. It pushes the boundaries of positionality. And so yes, if you guys can, if you can speak about kind of, what you think, how you think your work is queer, even though it's not explicitly queer, in the same way that I think, for example, in the mainstream, they think queer, right? Yeah, so maybe, so just, and it's not, it's any kind of answer in a sense of like thinking through, because kapwa itself is not gendered, right? Like the word kapwa is not like, it's not a gendered. Yes, yeah, so exactly too, right? So I think there's so much of that we need to kind of think through, and I think you're starting in that wonderful conversation. So yeah, I'd love to hear more. Yeah, Christine, I feel like you have it.
Oh, well, I guess, sorry, so the question is, how is it queer?
Yeah.
I guess because related to it is, for me personally, for Kapwa, I feel like everybody who's a member of the collective is going through their own healing process. And then it's just kind of recognizing that other people are also going through the same, and somehow our paths are kind of meeting or parallel in terms of we're reconnecting with the indigenous as a way to heal. The decolonizing process for us is related to reconnecting with what is indigenous. And that's, I guess, not something that everybody feels compelled to go through, that process of kinship through the process of healing,
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, Casey, want to say something?
I think for me, one of the most impactful experiences, and I mentioned this in my talk, was working with the participants of the Clutch program. So being in a situation where surrounded by these participants, being surrounded by conversations about what does identity mean, do you relate, or how do you situate yourself in artistic practice, or even in just the city? Like, all of these questions were a part of that program, and so it was queer because to think about art, to think about identity, to think about the space that these conversations were having, was just really intervening on the structures and programs that are sort of laid out for those conversations to happen. I don't know if I'm really making any sense. So, in the program, they're like making their own art gallery out of like an unsuspecting space. And I'm like, this is queer because this is pushing normative standards of how people view art. It's pushing, how people produce art, and all the while, they're pushing each other to really talk and articulate what it means to be Filipino here. So,
yeah. And I've seen, and I've seen the work of Clutch. I mean, it's also incredibly sexual. I mean, I think there's like a lot of sex in the. I mean, going back to, I want to talk about sex. Roland was like, yes, let's talk about it. So let's do it. But I think that but I think in these art spaces, right, like that there's a way in which, what does it mean to be an all-women collective? What does it mean to be an all-women collective producing art? What does it mean to be an all-women collective producing art and being the children of, let's say, migrants? What does it mean? And all of these kind of things compound on each other. And then what does it mean to do that and talk about sex, right? And in ways that are both funded by the state in some ways and not funded by the state in some ways. And I think that that is kind of really interesting, right? Or even, I think, Christine, and you kind of mentioned interspecies, right? But I think the reason that I find the plant, your art piece about the singing plants incredibly moving is that it really pushes the boundaries of intimacy. Like, what does it mean to be intimate with a plant in ways that are pleasurable? And can be sexual, actually, right? Because it's felt. That is also about a different type of indigenous knowledge. And I think that is really powerful. And it doesn't necessarily kind of have to be formed in the rubrics of queerness in the way in which like LGBTQ functions. But I think what powerfully is demonstrated in your talks is that queerness as a kind of mode of being, right, with others, right? That doesn't get to be kind of policed in ways that, or tries to push away from that policing at the moment that it's almost happening,
Right.
So.
I also think that intersectionality is really intersectionality is really important to consider because when I first started attending the conferences like in Baguio, I would often ask like, where's queer identity and talking about indigeneity, and then people started telling me, Joe, maybe it's the question you're asking that you're not getting the response. So it kind of made me think of different worldviews and paradigms, which is it's really jarring and uncomfortable to get out of that way of thinking in the world. And it's incredibly growthful, which is what I'm learning. It's a process with our collective and as an individual. I just think of like Black Lives Matter, just what happened. You see like so many young queer Black organizers in that, talking about many things in an intersectional way, because we have many issues. We got a lot going on, and queerness is one, and may not even be on the map. Like, for instance, gay marriage with Ladad party list isn't even on one of their platforms for campaigning. They don't even have their big pride celebration is on the first week of December, unlike the rest of most of the world, because it's on Human Rights Week, because their main platform is around human rights law being passed in the Philippines so that queer people can get jobs without being harassed, without being sexually assaulted, so that rural queers have safety and a safe place to get sexual health information, some place to go if you experience abuse and violence, and at the same time be able to still be fabulous and talk about sex and enjoy the privileges, I think, of being out, that it takes time and it's not the same for everybody. So those are things that it's ongoing learning just through doing this community work. And thank you for being here. I feel like this is another part of bridging that.
Thank you so much. Oh yes, a question from JP. Oh yes, I will just run.
I wanted to ask a question about how Indigenous is mobilized in the work of the Kapwa Collective. In your talk, you mentioned kind of different Indigenous traditions. I wonder about how, like, who has access to Indigenous? Is it an ancestral tie? What is its relationship to Filipino or Filipina? What is the relationship between those terms, and does identifying as Filipino give me, for example, access to indigenous cultures that may not be ancestral to me, but maybe in the Philippines? Like, what are the ethics of accessing indigeneity, I guess is what I want to ask. How is that relationship forged and how is it mobilized?
The reason why I ended up going to that conference is because Roland told me about it. Because he's like, oh, you might be interested in Indigenous because you play Indigenous instruments. But then after that, after I've explored a little bit and kind of like been led down that path, the way that I've kind of like grappled with this question of like responsibility is sort of, I guess, related to intent. Like, what is my intent in reconnecting with this? And I think a lot of it, as I said before, is related to decolonizing, and is a way to heal. Because the theories that I encountered in university, like for example, post-structuralism, wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to kind of like help me kind of understand how I'm a whole person here living in Canada as a queer Filipina person who is diasporic. And so this question of responsibility is related to how do I build my relationships with Indigenous people, and what do I do with the teachings that I have? And do I benefit from it? And if I benefit from it, how do I transform it into something good in the world? So I like to believe that the things that I've learned, I've embodied, and in my work as a settlement worker, or I help other newcomers in Canada kind of find a place to belong in Canada, it comes out in my work as an artist, as a community artist, when they share Kulintang music. And when I learn about Kulintang music, what do I do with the things that I've learned and the things that I've performed? I mean, it's always like this is always like done as a way to kind of heal, to help other people heal, and as a way to kind of showcase a different kind of being in the world that pop music or, sorry, but like, you know, like music that we hear on the radio isn't the only music that's out there. There's like other forms of music, and there's other traditions that are out there. And besides that, these traditions are coming from different understandings of the world. It's not just capitalist, neoliberalist, all of these things, right? So I think it has to do with intent and maintaining that relationship with the people that we learn from, and also how you move in the world. So I've been talking to a healer, Lenape healer, and she's been saying that it's because when you've accessed these lessons, the way that you move in the world, other people see that you're different, and there's something about the way that you move in the world, and they learn from that. If it's something that, if you go in with, you know, like a pure heart and a pure mind, and what you learn, you embody and you accept, and you come with integrity, other people can see that, and that's also a way of teaching. That's responsibility, in my opinion.
Thank you for that answer, Christine.
Somehow that you had managed to transcend those issues, and so that is really making me think about the persistence of these frames around race and gender and the performance. It's really kind of like really unsettled me. So that's a good thing, and that really will make me think. Just thinking about the last question, I just wanted to say that the Kappa Collective seems to be engaging in a really kind of crucial conversation at this point. And your work really highlights the kind of cultural sharing and a cultural rediscovery as a part of an anti-colonial process. But I'm wondering to what extent your collective has also had conversation around those other questions of Indigenous identities and indigeneity, particularly around questions of sovereignty and relation to nation-state formation and oppression, basically, and many instances around the world about cultural genocide.
So it's an ongoing process. We met each other 2 years ago, and we formed 2 years ago, but we've also kind of done our own kind of individual work. We work with healers, we work with some spiritual guides, and also academic elders, like at First Nations House at U of T. And some of us, for instance, our friend Amy's just come back from a 1-year sabbatical in Hawaii to learn from Indigenous leaders there around the taro root and farming practices. We're all into plants, and she's learned about how so much of a decolonization process is understanding about how how economy and capitalism impacts on indigenized bodies, and one of the other things that our friend Jennifer Maramba has done is connect with the School of Living Traditions and connect when we did the Tivoli x Toronto residency or a cultural exchange. It was in connection with connected with Indigenous leaders here and having a dialogue around those issues and kind of a shared identity across different Indigenous nations. And there's no borders around that, is what we learned from that process. But to understand that it's similar discussions around self-determination and nationhood. Our friend Michael Peking is doing grad studies at Trent University. He's at York now, sorry. He graduated from Trent and he's now at York doing grad studies. He focuses on different things. One of them is dance, and that's around how to perform what those issues are around learning and indigeneity and performance. And so it's an ongoing process. And for myself, our next projects would be around connecting with other Indigenous groups in the Philippines. For instance, there's a group that we've been talking with in Sagada, which is the Kasiana Healing Garden and Retreat, run by our friend Dom Ang, whose husband was killed during the strikes in Sagada. Sagada is a no-fly zone, and there were military strikes that basically assassinated key rebels who are fighting for Indigenous nationhood rights. And also there's, of course, a national people's struggle in the Philippines. She took her grief and instead of turning it into anger, followed a Indigenous value of Kasiana, which is to go through a process of I wouldn't say forgiveness. I don't want to articulate it. It's not my practice, but it's around putting grief and anger into a peacemaking process, and the land, healing the land, the animals and the children around that bombing site. It's turned into a healing garden. So we're learning that there's many different ways. There's political, social, economic, and also spiritual ways of going through the decolonization process, and those are just some examples.
I also want to add that related to that, like sovereignty and like helping the Indigenous people, for example, with their own sense of like, sorry, and like self-determination, for example, as Joe said, there's different ways that we can respond to it. There's no one way that you could do it. But for example, when Jen Rambo went to visit the Tivoli in South Cotabato, what resulted from that kind of visit, from that month-long visit, is that they've asked us to maybe sell some of their products here in Canada. So they have collectives over there, cooperatives, Tivoli cooperatives that make like crafts, and they've asked us to maybe we can open up the market for them and have their products be sold here. And also the fact that we brought them here to Canada is part of also that bridging and helping them with their sovereignty and their like self-determination, is like giving them the opportunity to be here in Canada, and then connecting with other Indigenous people here in Canada who've in some ways have been advanced, a little bit more advanced in how they've gained power through the nation state. For example, a lot of them are in academia, some of them are in academia, or they might have their own establishments here that we could go to, like for example, the Native Canadian Center, things like that. So that kind of dialogue that we've enabled by bringing them over here. So instead of us translating for them or telling them this is what you should do, like why don't you come here and see how they do it here, and then maybe that could be your own learning and you could take it back.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I mean, I think that this is a